The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 10th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said to the 12, "A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher, and the slave like the master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, and even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny before my Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have come not to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." The Gospel of the Lord. So I was pointing out last week that our lectionary readings this year simply move through Matthew's Gospel without regard to what we may be doing in our congregation this week or what's going on in our secular society. But sometimes you get lucky, as we did last week, where there was this story about Jesus sending missionaries out to spread the good news on the same day that we were sending off our missionaries to Honduras. That worked really well. This week, however, we continue reading through chapter 10 of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus says things like, "I have come to set a man against his father," and "Whoever loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me." So, happy Father's Day. In fact, in all 15 verses of today's gospel reading, there is hardly anything warm and fuzzy except for maybe this thing about the hairs on your head. It's almost all about conflict and stress and being unpopular even within your own family. So, whenever you find words like this coming from Jesus, you should ask yourself, why would Jesus say stuff like this? And also, because nobody really likes hearing these things, especially on Father's Day or Mother's Day, think about why, from a marketing standpoint, these are not the best things to say if you're trying to get people to follow you. This is, after all, Jesus is talking to his disciples here. The second question you should always ask yourself is, why would Matthew or any of the biblical writers remember these words and write them down? Because after all, it wasn't like these guys had huge backup drives to record every little thing Jesus said. And so when they wrote things down, they had very limited space. It would be really easy to say, I know Jesus said that stuff, but let's not write that stuff down. Let's write something more warm and fuzzy. I suspect that Matthew didn't find these words of Jesus really warm and fuzzy either. And he would have preferred not to think about stress and conflict and being unpopular even within your own family. After all, none of us do either. But the problem was that when Matthew wrote these words near the end of the first century, these things really were the way most people in his community were experiencing life. Matthew wrote to and for an early community of Christians, most of whom had been Jewish, and many of whom still considered themselves to be loyal Jews because they were following Jesus, the Messiah. But for those first Christians, it was often the case that trying to be faithful to God by following Jesus in their daily lives meant that they often got ridiculed and insulted. Jesus' words about being called Beelzebul, that's the Hebrew word for the devil, were words they could understand because they were also being called names for following a false god. Because these, we read these words in the New Testament and they get put on bumper stickers today. It says, "Jesus is Lord." this is great, right? Everybody thinks this is cool. But for an early first century Jewish Christian to say Jesus is Lord was to identify Jesus as being one with God. That was heresy to your Jewish family. That was like worshiping a false god. And also, from a Gentile perspective, the Romans required soldiers to burn incense on the altar of the emperor and swear allegiance by saying, Caesar is Lord. Jesus is Lord sounded like treason. You got insulted. You got ridiculed. Sometimes it was dangerous. Following Jesus in their daily lives also caused stress in other relationships. Christians were indeed being disowned by their families and often thrown out of their religious communities because of their weird beliefs. People were told, if you want to say Jesus is the Messiah, not here in this synagogue. This was what was going on, and this was an inter-Jewish debate. And so when we read these things, we've got to understand these were Jews and Jews talking to each other. These were not Jews and Gentiles talking to each other. But they were also being disowned by some of their own Gentile families who thought the ways they were living were just too weird. And often following Jesus in their daily lives was causing them to live and act in new and uncomfortable ways. Take up your cross, says Jesus, and that's an extreme example. But followers of Jesus were also being called to do things like love their enemies, contribute to the needs of others, things that really did affect both their lifestyles and their wallets. That is not always a comfortable or stress-free thing to do. That was the reality for early Christians. And it made life uncomfortable and uneasy for them. But what really makes readings like this so uncomfortable and uneasy for us is not the history lesson, but the recognition that often being a follower of Jesus is still like that for us today. Deep down, most of us, at least I know I do, I want God and our relationship with God to be something that makes us feel warm and fuzzy. I want Jesus to be the one who brings peace and joy to my life, not a sword. And I want faith to be something that helps me escape from stress and conflict, not something that causes me stress and conflict. And I'd like being a person of faith to be something that people say is good and a praiseworthy thing instead of something that makes them look at me like I'm really kind of weird. And so on some core level, I read these words and I want to say, yeah, but that was then and this is now, and it shouldn't be like that today in my society. But the reality is for us, is that it's often the same as it was for those early Christians, and it's becoming more so like that for us. Because as much as I'd like for Jesus to make my life warm and fuzzy, and even when I do feel warm and fuzzy about Jesus, it's often the case for me and for you that being a follower of Jesus is not always received as a positive thing by others. You know, the fastest growing group of religious, when they do surveys, Gallup and the Pew Charitable Trust, they do surveys about what's the biggest religious group. Almost the biggest, the fastest growing religious group anyway in the United States is the nuns, not N-U-N-S, the N-O-N-E-S, nuns. I have no religion. I am not into any of that religious stuff. The people who are not interested in any of it. Many folks who are not Christian often also describe their experiences of Christians as being hypocritical, insensitive, judgmental, anti-homosexual, and arrogant. And sadly, we know that there are many people who call themselves Christians who resemble that remark. And really, that's pretty much a modern definition of what it means to be called Beelzebul, to be an ugly, evil, nasty person. And even if that's earned by some folks who call themselves Christian, it can make it hard, but utterly necessary for us to identify as Christians and talk about what our faith in Jesus really means outside of church gatherings. Because somebody's got to say, look, this is what being a Christian is really all about because it's this way for me. For us too, then, being a Christian and following Jesus can cause stress in our other relationships. I mean, some of us do have families for whom faith and religious practice really are a great source of stress, even if it's sitting at the table and arguing about what it means to be a real Christian. But we also live in a society where finding time and space to nurture faith means having to balance other commitments and other relationships. There is no set-aside time for nurturing our faith as there might have been a few decades ago. Now it's common for us to have to balance work, kids' sports and birthday parties, and even our own personal family and personal time and space, aside from the kinds of things we used to do. There are lots and lots of us who have situations where if we have to say to our friends or family, hey, I'm doing this thing with church, or I'm just going to worship right now, they're like, what? But we're all doing this other thing. Why aren't you coming with us? And that can cause stress in our personal relationships. And sometimes for us, setting priorities and boundaries can cause stress and even conflict. And often for us, in trying to follow Jesus in our daily lives, we often find that it causes us to live and act in new and uncomfortable ways. If it's true that some people have a messed up idea of who we think God is, then Jesus is also calling us to be people who reorder some things in our lives so that our attitudes and actions convey a new reality about God in our lives. And that affects our lifestyle and our priorities and our wallets. And a couple of decades ago, it could seem like serving God was going to be done by some religious professionals, like missionaries. We'll send off missionaries and we'll just, let them do the God work. And we could always come to church in a building that always seemed to have been there and where lots of things just got done by a whole legion of volunteers with more time than us, and of course paid for by people with more money than us. But it's not the way it's been for a very long time now. And if we're concerned and impressed by Christians in other countries who really do, in some cases, actually face death simply by being Christian, then we should at least be people who are willing to adjust and reorder how we spend our time and energy and money to show our faith in Jesus to the world. And sometimes the most important things we can do are simply to say, I'm going to take time and I'm going to put some money and I'm going to spend some time volunteering here to help some other people because this is what I do as a person of faith. And that has a huge impact on other people around us, much more than if you stand there and talk to them about theology. So, I really wish, especially on Father's Day, that Jesus would tell me that being his disciple would make people like me and take stress and conflict out of my life. I am sure that his first disciples would have liked that also. But disciples of Jesus from the first day until now continue to be willing to put up with the conflict and deal with the stress and pay the price. And it's not because stress or conflict or cost are happy things. I think it's rather because at some point in our lives we realize that anything worthwhile, anything that really brings life and joy and meaning into our lives comes with a cost. And things that bring life and joy and meaning are worth the cost. Disciples since the beginning have found life and joy and meaning in their relationship with God that Jesus brings. And so it's worth the cost. But I think Jesus had something even deeper in mind. And that something is this. Anybody can talk about God or religion or values, even people who really don't believe in God. But when people are willing to rearrange their lives and put up with stress and pay a price for what they say they believe, that's what makes faith real in their lives and in the lives of others. Sharing our faith in real and meaningful ways is always what Jesus is calling us to do. And in the end, being willing to put up with the stress and pay the price is really the only thing that just might make our faith real and believable and life-giving to people who may have given up already on God or even any kind of faith at all.